What's up, y'all? It's Kyle with Basketball Business, and I just wanted to get on here and talk about the new report that HunterBrook Media and Pablo Torre dropped today, alleging that Memphis Grizzlies owner Robert Pera is a key cog in the Russian drone warfare against Ukraine by supplying them through his company Ubiquiti with Wi-Fi technology to help enable drone communication on the front lines of Russia's war. First off, what a headline! This is like a Mad Lib of crazy NBA and geopolitical news. We have an owner of an NBA team allegedly funding a war that's using drone warfare halfway across the world. I'm not going to get into the whole politics or strategy of the war. I think we all know what's going on over there. But if these allegations are true, these are crazy, serious bad news potentially for Robert Pera. I mean, the UN has called these allegations that Russia is doing of drone warfare crimes against humanity to the Ukrainian people. As of the time of this recording, Ubiquiti, the alleged company supplying Wi-Fi communications to Russian drone warfare, dropped about 0.5% compared to what it closed at yesterday. And you'd think with such big allegations, it would, crater, but that hasn't happened. So why is that? Ultimately, this is a story about wealth, corporate structure, and political connections that will have long-lasting effects that we really can't see the immediate impact to. Before we dive into the weeds of this story, let's talk about who initially reported and broke it. It was a collab between my guy Pablo Torre and HunterBrook Media. I'm sure you've heard of Pablo Torre with the whole aspiration Kawhi Leonard, Los Angeles Clippers, Steve Ballmer's salary cap scandal, and his reporting on the NBA gambling investigations. HunterBrook, you may not know who they are, but they're a short position selling firm. So essentially what they do is take out inverse positions against a stock and bet that it's going to drop. And how they do this is they do this long-ranging research of what they did with Ubiquiti, for example. Then they buy positions on the market that predicting the stock is going to drop before releasing their news. Then they release their news, and then the market reacts to the news with the stock falling, and in turn, HunterBrook profits. So they have that disclosure that they are making money off this reporting, which is definitely important to note when we're figuring out the truth to the story and who's right, who's wrong, what's being alleged, all of that. So it doesn't invalidate their reporting, but it's definitely something you want to factor in when you're looking at this story. Additionally, HunterBrook also has a litigation arm as part of their whole media empire conglomerate thing, where they protect themselves against people suing them for stories like these, as well as enhance their research for their short positions in media reporting. And they're apparently investigating lawsuits on behalf of Ukrainian victims from the Russia-Ukraine war. So back to the original story where Pablo Torre and HunterBrook alleged that Memphis Grizzlies owner Robert Pera and his company Ubiquiti are helping the Russian war effort by supplying them with critical infrastructure for drone surveillance and communications. Well, you're probably wondering, what is Ubiquiti exactly? Pretty much they're long-range Wi-Fi and communications providers. So if you're like in the forest or in somewhere where you don't have a lot of service and you're wondering, man, it'd be really nice if I had, Wi-Fi or service in this remote place. Well, Ubiquiti supplies Wi-Fi routers, Wi-Fi infrastructure, communication infrastructure, things like that to help with communications over long distances. So, you may have Wi-Fi through Google Fiber or Spectrum or something like that. This is like them, but instead for remote and enterprise solutions in like non-residential areas like a house or a urban center, things like that. I'm just going to read off my notes here about what is exactly alleged. So it starts off saying that Ubiquiti radio bridge antenna for drone warfare is critical communication infrastructure for the Russian military, with Ukrainian signals officers estimating that 80% of Russian radio bridges used for this drone warfare were supplied by Ubiquiti. And a direct quote from Ukrainian soldier is, without Ubiquiti, these drones would not work. They'd be flying blind. So pretty much Ubiquiti provides real-time data transmission capabilities for the drones. So when the drone pilots are flying the drones, they could actually see where the drones are flying and where to drop their payloads, things like that. Otherwise, as the Ukrainian soldier said, they'd be flying blind. There's been 9 Russian units in the military accused of war crimes using this exact equipment. So these are pretty serious allegations if true. It's also important to note, why is this bad in the first place? Well, because Russia has sanctions placed against them. So that means they can't buy or sell or trade really any material goods from a foreign country or foreign entity, that's pretty much every major Western country and company in the world, is blacklisted and sanctioned from doing business with Russia ever since the war started in around February of 2022. So what happened here is being alleged is that there would be a third party middleman, either a country or a company, that would buy these supplies from Ubiquiti and then middleman them over to Russian war units, which is a big no-no. That's textbook sanctions violations. So how did HunterBrook Media and Pablo Torre find this out exactly? You can't really call up the Russian military and be like, hey, it's HunterBrook Media, noted short position seller, or hey, it's Pablo Torre. You may remember me from when I investigated one of the richest people in all of the world. Well, they went undercover, old school investigative journalism. They posed as Russian military officers using Russian VPNs and Russian military addresses, and they got nearly a dozen Ubiquiti sellers to confirm they'd sell and ship the sanctioned devices and parts to war-occupied Ukraine, including a US-based distributor, Multilink Solutions, agreed to ship them to Turkey, knowing the final destination was in Russia. That's textbook sanctions violations if the allegations are true. Again, these are allegations. And through data that HunterBrook was able to collect and analyze, they found that Ubiquiti shipments to Russia were actually up 66% after the invasion export began in 2022. And the latest Ubiquiti models that were released after the war started in Russia have been showing up coincidentally in Russia. So that's proving there's ongoing supply chain access and ease of access for these sanctioned items. Now you might be wondering, how does any company in the world, much less one owned by the Memphis Grizzlies owner, allow this to happen? Well, it's pretty much by Ubiquiti's design, based on their whole corporate structure. They pretty much outsource all of their sales to third-party vendors. They have really lean operations, very small corporate staff, very small compliance departments, and they literally said in their SEC filings, quote, "We do not have any visibility on where their products end up." So as I explained, where one was going through a middleman in Turkey, the vendors posed as a Turkish buyer or a buyer from Kazakhstan or any other European or Asian country, and then they turn around and immediately flip it to the Russian military. So this gives Robert Pera and the American Ubiquiti team some plausible deniability with all of this. They can point to direct actors in supply chain and say those are rogue third-party vendors and absolve themselves of direct culpability. Courts rarely find the bar to be met for criminal activity of this nature for C-suite executives. They need to either prove direct personal involvement or willful blindness or oversight failure so severe it's bad faith. And just talking to legal experts and reading about the situation, I don't think that situation is going to meet that criteria for the courts. Where Pera escapes legal liability, he may get hit with economic liability because he owns 93% of Ubiquiti's outstanding stock. And if sanctions or fines or any government action is taken against them, that will hurt their stock in a negative way. The criminal prosecution requires proving willful conduct, and there's no evidence yet that personally Robert Pera directed any of the sanctions evading techniques that Ubiquiti allegedly did. Now let's get to potentially the most interesting part, what the NBA will do to Robert Pera and the Memphis Grizzlies if they'll do anything. The collective bargaining agreement states the commissioner can fine up to $10 million and suspend for, quote, conduct detrimental. And it also says the board of governors, which is pretty much the other owners of the NBA teams, can terminate ownership with 3/4 vote, which is 23 or 30 owners. When you hear NBA owner getting forced to sell, your mind probably goes to Donald Sterling, and with good reason. There's a common misconception here. The NBA forced Donald Sterling out. That's actually not the case. Adam Silver said, quote, "I don't have the right to take away his team." And remember, Adam Silver works for the owners, so that's the owners saying it. The reality is Donald Sterling was never forced out by the owners. 3 doctors found, quote, "mild cognitive impairment consistent with early Alzheimer's," which triggered a trust provision where his wife Shelley removed him as a co-trustee because essentially he was not fit to run the team. Wow, it took you over 40 years to realize that? But that's besides the point. Shelley then turns around and sells to Ballmer for $2 billion. And while on the surface this may look like collusion between the NBA owners, Steve Ballmer, Shelley Sterling, and the doctors, it really was just an unfortunate timing of events that all coalesced together And this whole Donald Sterling scandal allowed the doctors to investigate the Alzheimer's, which then triggered the trust revision, which then triggered the sale, so on and so forth. But there's another owner that was forced out, per se. Robert Sarver of the Phoenix Suns a few years ago. In his case, an investigation found that racial slurs were used at least 5 times by him, and there was a toxic workplace harassment environment and culture going around within the Phoenix Suns front office. Adam Silver's punishment to him was a 1-year suspension and a $10 million fine, the maximum allowed under the CBA. But again, Silver explicitly stated that he did not have the power to force a sale. So why did Sarver sell? Well, he voluntarily sold after sponsors like PayPal threatened to completely pull out of sponsoring the Suns and remove all their signage from the arena, which hurts their bottom line. So that's the through line here. Documented conduct within the team offices wasn't enough to force him out until the money started getting messed with. That's what you should be asking if you think Robert Pera is going to be forced to sell. Will these allegations hurt the bottom line of the Memphis Grizzlies and the NBA? With Donald Sterling, players were threatening to boycott playoff games, which was a direct threat to the biggest revenue stream. With Robert Sarver, sponsors were threatening to pull out, a direct revenue threat as well. With Robert Pera and Ubiquiti, it's an abstract sanctions violations at a separate company, so there's no direct impact to NBA revenues yet. There's no documented cases of any major American sports league disciplining an owner for non-sports business activities like what's being alleged here. Nothing for criminal conduct, sanctions violations, nothing. The closest we got was former 49ers owner Eddie DeBartolo's 1998 felony plea, which resulted in a negotiated transfer of the team sale, not a forced removal. So we're really entering uncharted waters here. But what government punishment could Robert Pera face? OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, operates on strict liability, so even unwitting violations, what could be alleged here, are still violations. The current max penalty is $377 grand per violation, or twice the transaction value, whichever is larger. And since these are multi-million-dollar Wi-Fi and communications transmitters being sent to Russia, they'll do the latter of twice the transaction values. But fines are just fines. What will really hit Ubiquiti if these allegations are true is export denial orders and debarment from government contracting, pretty much saying they can't do any business with the government, which will take out a large chunk of their revenue pie. Regardless of what happens, this is literally the first day of the allegations being brought to the public light, so it'll be a lot of investigations, a lot of trials, all that really fun government court stuff, and we won't know the answer for a few years at least. So looking at what happens next, we're waiting for the government to announce an official investigation, if they'll do one, Ubiquiti potentially being added to restricted entity list, congressional hearings, the whole 9 yards of a wide-ranging geopolitical sanctions evading investigation. And on the NBA side, nothing will really happen until the government does anything. They'll try and keep this under wraps. But if a Ukrainian player in the league, I believe Max Shulga on the Celtics is the only Ukrainian one, if they speak out, maybe they'll say something. If sponsors threaten to pull from the Grizzlies because of ties and association with this story, something will also be done because that's impacting the revenue bottom line. But there's not really much, in my opinion, that's going to come with this story until we get more news about investigations, things like that, because the NBA doesn't want to look like they're doing too much against the government or too little against the government. So they want them to set the precedent, be the first mover, and then take action from there. There's no precedent for a story like this in the NBA or professional sports as a whole. There's no mechanism to remove Robert Pera as an owner for a story like this. And the NBA doesn't really have an appetite to keep this in the forefront of the news cycle, especially when trade season is going on, the regular season is coming to a close, All-Star game, all of the fun things that we like to talk about. But the NBA, we really don't want to talk about an owner of a team potentially violating international sanctions rules by selling Wi-Fi communication equipment to Russia to help with drone warfare. But what do you think about it? What is your reaction to this whole story? Drop a comment, let me know, and make sure to like this video and subscribe to Basketball Business for more great videos on how business decisions like allegedly selling communication equipment to the Russian war effort impacts the on-court game of basketball. Until next time, this is Kyle, and I'll see you in the next one.